Many of us wonder whether our family contains a really interesting story, a bit of sort of history that we didn't know. Sometimes it's a story that's been passed down the generations and we just think, if I've got time, I'll go off and research that. Well, one person who actually did that is joining me today, David Worsfold, and he uncovered an absolutely fascinating story about his extended family. David, welcome, good to see you. So let's start with a simple bit. What is the story that you sort of discovered before we got into how you turned it into a book?
Well, the story is about my wife's maternal grandfather, who was born in Galway in 1870 and spent 50 years in a British uniform. And it's a very rich and very varied life he lived.
So for an Irishman of that generation, sort of joining the British Army, and not just joining it for a short period, but actually having a huge career that I think spans a couple of wars and many other sort of adventures, was quite extraordinary.
Oh, it was. I mean, obviously, that generation, it wasn't that unusual for Irishmen to join the British forces. Ireland was part of the United Kingdom then. He trained as a doctor and joined the Indian Medical Service, so went to India. Spent 30 years in the Indian Medical Service, became a colonel, very senior officer, and he did serve through the First World War in the Indian Medical Service in Egypt, Aden and Mesopotamia, but he also managed to serve in the Second World War as well as a ship surgeon on troop ships all the way through the Second World War when he was in his 70s.
So this is Thomas Bernard Kelly, I think is
That is correct.
Name. So as you say, from your wife's side of the family, so where did the story originate? Is this you know, almost one that you'd heard that family celebrations over the years?
Oh, very much so. He died before my wife was born, so I mean she never met him. But yeah, the awareness of the Kelly story exists right across the family, and the highlights of his life. Yes, he was born in Galway, trained as a doctor, went to India. They knew that he'd been on the young husband expedition to Tibet in the 1900s because he made the headlines for saving a fellow officer from being killed by an assassin when he was in Lhasa. They knew that. They knew that he'd served in Mesopotamia in the First World War and won the DSO. They knew that he'd been on troop ships in the Second World War. Those are the highlights, and they knew that, but there were a lot of gaps that clearly they didn't know.
So let's talk, you know, you and I are both journalists. In fact, we've worked together on and off for quite a long time. And all journalists have a book in them, it's sort of said. I guess you probably thought that. But what really sort of prompted you to kind of sit down, and how did you sort of cope with the challenge of actually pulling together, you know, a book of quite considerable sort of detail, which I guess must have taken you a huge amount of research?
It did, and I mean the challenge is quite interesting when you take as your starting point a family history where where a lot of it is anecdotal, a lot of it is an oral history that exists within the family. As I said, the family knew the highlights, but actually when you wrote that down, that covered but a small proportion of his life. So clearly there were some big gaps. I thought for some time that there is a story to be told about Kelly, and about 3 and a bit years ago I stopped telling myself there might be a story to be told, and I just, look, you are going to go out there and you are going to find out whether there really is a story and whether all of the knowledge that we have actually stands up.
So some of the stuff must have been relatively easy to verify. You could use sort of British military records, I guess. Other parts of his life, I'm assuming the actual records were perhaps thin, maybe not even still with us.
Well, there are some that have been lost over the years. I mean, you know, inevitably, the places he served, the periods of conflict he served through, you know, some of the records of his early life in Ireland, because you know the Irish Civil War, the National Archives were lost in the 1920s. So, you know, that creates some big holes that you can't easily verify. But I mean, yeah, some of it exists. You know, the Indian Army lists are in the British Library, and from that I was able to piece together exactly where he was, but not what he was doing. So building a story on those bare bones was often a challenge. And you know, some of those, you know, fleshing out some of those stories was harder than others.
And I know in the book you've got some fabulous pictures, and the pictures are sort of reproduced incredibly well. And you've got sort of notes and letters that he wrote to some, amazing places that you wouldn't even think of. I think there's some record relating to sort of Tehran, for example.
Yeah, well, he was. It was one of the big gaps. He went when he went to India. He served on the northwest frontier. He then went to Tibet for a year and a bit on the Young Husband expedition. There was then largely a gap from about 1907 till the First World War, which was the family didn't really know where he was. In fact, he spent 2 and a bit years of those in Persia, which of course was is now Iran, and as you say, Tehran is the capital. So some of the records that explained where he was and what he was doing, fighting the plague, is what he was there for. They were in Tehran, and of course they were in French as well, because it was under Belgian control at the time.
So let's talk about some of the challenges of writing. I mean, you and I as journalists, we can knock out 500 words like that. A couple of thousand words for a feature, again, it's not the biggest challenge, but there's a lot more words in a book like this. So how did you sort of kind of face that challenge? I mean, how did you, I guess, develop the discipline to actually pull it all together into a book of 60,000-70,000 words?
You're quite right, Lawrence. That's a huge step from doing what you and I have done every day of our working lives for the last 30 odd years. I did massive amount of research, because first of all I had to convince myself there was a story there, and I had to try and fill in some of those gaps. Beginning of last year, I got to the stage where I'd filled in most of the gaps, and I thought, you've got to stop digging and start writing. So I made myself sit down, and I thought, now can I turn this into a book? Is there a strong enough narrative? Is there a good enough story here? And can I tell it? So I literally made myself sit down for 2 or 3 weeks and say, right, you are now going to try and write this and prove to yourself you can do it.
And once you've sort of completed the book, everybody has the chance to either self-publish or approach independent professional publishers. What was your sort of decision-making process there? My process really was, yes, I could self-publish, and I looked into that, and that was my long stop. What I did want to get it independently published for, I think, sort of 3 principal reasons. Firstly, it's someone else that really knows publishing, knows that market, saying, yeah, this is worth publishing. We believe in it. You say, have you got the belief in yourself to write a book? Well, yes, I can write it. Have I got the belief that anyone else wants to read it? That's another step. So the approval of an independent publisher is important. Secondly, of course, you can self-publish, and that's fine. You get a book out of it. You've then got to sell it. You've got to get it to a market. Okay, finding the right publisher opens up that market. And then, of course, you've got the whole expertise in terms of production, design, and everything that you would have to learn from scratch if you were self-publishing. So trying to find an independent publisher was important. So your route there was you went to the London Book Fair in sort of 2015, having already researched it, seen who was there, and just made some appointments and met some relevant publishers. Yeah,
I did. Well, it was at the stage where I'd written the first 30,000 words. I proved to myself that I could write the book, and that I could see where it was going to go. I could see that there was a story and that I was going to be able to tell it. And so I went to the London Book Fair, made lots of appointments with publishers and pitched it to them. And I ended up, very fortunately, being able to choose between 2. And I went with the one that I thought was going to suit the book the best. And I don't regret that.
Good. Now, just one sort of anecdote. What was one of the most surprising things that you found out about his life that you hadn't known before you started the research, that you went, God, that's amazing? And it sounds, it sounds from what we've talked about already, what an extraordinary life he had anyway. Yeah,
there were a number of sort of revelatory moments. I think there's a theme which struck me that came out as I found out various things about, is how he always cared for the underprivileged. Look, he was a creature of the British Empire, and he was a creature of his generation, his era. But wherever he went, he was always going above and beyond for the underprivileged, for the people he actually didn't have to care for. And that manifested itself almost everywhere he went. There was something that sort of verified that as a key characteristic. And I think that was quite a revelation, because the family pictures, pictures of that era make people look very austere, don't they, and very unapproachable, and you don't really get a feel for the person. And I warmed to that aspect of his character. So that was certainly a sort of general revelation. There are times when you think, I've run into a brick wall here. My biggest eureka moment was finding that I was trying to work out where he was in the First World War. I had the dates. Yes, went from Egypt to Aden, back to Egypt to Mesopotamia. Great. But what did he do during those 4 years? And that was proving quite difficult. And the war diaries from medical units from that theatre of war, the war against the Ottoman Empire, frankly, are patchy. Not, if they were kept, they've not all survived. And I mean, the National Archives is a wonderful place, but sometimes some of these things are actually not perfectly indexed either. And I was going through a box of records, half in hope. And I found a folder that said 105th Indian Field Ambulance, and I thought, gosh, that's his unit. And I opened it up and I thought, I recognise that handwriting, because we've got letters that he wrote. And it was the start of the war diaries for every day of where he served in the First World War. And because of the character he was, they're written in a very anecdotal and sometimes deliberately challenging style, because he was, I think he was a bit of a pain in the butt to his senior officers if things weren't to his liking. And that was a huge revelation.
Well, David, good luck. Well done for achieving something most of us want to do but never get around to doing, and finding what a fabulous story.
Thank you very much, Lawrence.
Thank you.